we'll just start with this Georgia season. You go through the non-conference, the team's winning games, they're playing pretty well. And even through the first, I would argue maybe, 4 or 5 games of the SEC play, things are still looking pretty good. I mean, the 2 losses are to Kentucky and another really good team. I can't even remember. Tennessee, I believe, at the time. Close game to Tennessee. What changed? What was the narrative? What was the story of this season? What changed at that point?
Well, I think the biggest thing, Rick, is just close but not close enough with some of these games. You look at the Tennessee game, they were up like 11 with maybe 6 minutes to go. They led Alabama through the entire first half, and a good chunk of the second half, and Alabama came through. It's one of those situations with Georgia. This is Mike White's second season that, there was real progress made. I mean, you look at the games they played this year, really, other than Texas A&M, which was late in the season, and you could kind of feel like the season might have kind of gotten away from them a little bit. Senior night, they didn't play the way they wanted to. They wound up not scoring in like the last 6.5 minutes of that game. Other than that, in most of the SEC games they played this year, they were really competitive. I mean, they kept games close, and that wasn't something you saw a lot in year one. There were several blowouts along the way. So it's one of those things where on one side you say, yeah, there's been progress made. They've had freshmen step up, especially in these last few games to end the season and even in the SEC tournament. But, it didn't really translate to any big wins other than, they won at South Carolina early in the year. And I felt like that was sort of before we all knew what exactly South Carolina was going to be. We went into this season, I think at SEC Media Day, South Carolina was picked to finish last in the conference. So you thought, well, it's a nice win in Columbia, but, didn't really think a ton of it at the time. But no, it's a situation where I'm really fascinated with how this team shows up in the NIT. I think they're an improved team. It didn't really show up in the overall record, and they didn't really get, other than that South Carolina win, many marquee victories. But I think they see opportunity playing in this NIT, and I think they want to make the most of it.
So, we're talking about this. They lose 10 of 12 to end the regular season. And you said Mike White is just finishing up his second year here at Georgia. Last year, they go 16-16. What is the fan base's vibes towards Mike White at this point? Are they kind of the opinion that things are moving in the right direction? It just wasn't quite there this year. I see a lot of young guys to be excited about.
I think it's a lot of wait and see, and it's mostly just because of the portal era. And, I've written about it going back to that Texas A&M loss where, Mike really questioned the fight, which is something we haven't seen a lot with this team. But you see the pieces there. I mean, you've got your backcourt with Silas Demery Jr. and Blue Kane, and then you got Dylan James, who has probably been the brightest spot on this team in the last probably month of the season. But, it's the portal era, Rick. We don't know if these guys are coming back. So
Sure.
I think there's reason to be excited. You want to see if Georgia's able to keep these guys because those are 3 guys who will just be sophomores next year. And they're adding a 5-star in Asa Newell, a guy that I think answers a lot of problems that this team had, especially at the 4. I think he's a guy that's going to step in and not only give you scoring, but plays really, really good defense, which they've just lacked for the better part of this season at that position. So I think that there's some sort of waiting and seeing. I think that they want to see how this staff handles this offseason. Again, the pieces are there, but we know in this era of basketball, it doesn't matter if you had promising young guys if they decide to go somewhere else. So I think the next few weeks and the months will give fans a better feel for which direction this program is trending. I think it's a very important offseason coming up for Mike White and his staff.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Doesn't feel the same as it used to when you have a really promising freshman recruiting class come in. Before we get into some of the specifics about tomorrow night's matchup, how's the transfer portal impacting this week for you? I know on my end, there's all types of rumors circulating, even about some of the top players on the roster. I read your story. It seemed like the Georgia team is pretty much focused on the game at hand, and that's all they're talking about. But are there more rumors behind the scenes as far as the transfer portal goes?
Well, we've been hearing names about guys who might look at Georgia or who could become, candidates to transfer to Georgia. Rick, I'm sure that's the same there with you. It's sort of just wait and see mode. And again, based on just what I've heard and based even on last night, what we heard from Mike White and Noah Thomason, I think Georgia's going to be full go as far as the transfer portal goes. Really, the only question is forward Jabri Abdur-Rahim, who's been dealing with a foot injury. for the last few weeks. But yeah, I'm sure just like you, I've got notifications. They probably popped up, probably 8 or 9 since I've popped on and started talking to you. It's just, again, sort of a wait and see mode. I've seen a few reports so far of guys that Georgia's already reached out to. And again, there's a few names just sort of watching to see if they do, in fact, enter the portal. But it's a crazy time of year. And, for us too, Rick, Georgia spring practice for football is going on right now. So there's never a dull moment. It's going to be really interesting Tuesday. We get to do go to some football interviews, may get to watch a little bit of practice and probably turn right around and go to Stegman Coliseum and get ready for this basketball game.
Yeah, fortunately for me, I'm not going to be breaking down any zone blitzes or anything like that anytime soon. So, you brought him up, so let's get started with some of the personnel on this Georgia team. The big question on everyone's mind is Jabri Abdur-Rahim. How is the injury? I know you mentioned that he's day to day. Is there any other updates aside from that?
No, not really. And it's been sort of the same thing since the Ole Miss game. That was the second to last regular season game where it's just been, they've been kind of watching to see if he's been available. He made the trip to Auburn for the regular season finale, which makes you think, if there was no shot, then they wouldn't have taken him. And it was the same in Nashville for the SEC tournament, but he didn't play in any of those games. I'm sort of doubting that we're going to see Jabri. I do think that he's going to do everything he can, especially because he's an older guy. He's been at Georgia. This is his third year now. This is his first chance, or would be his first chance, to play in the postseason. So based on what I've heard, I'm not expecting him to play, but I do think he's a veteran guy. He's a guy that's been credited with being a really strong leader for this team, keeping this team together. I think he's going to do everything he can to play, but my expectation is we are not going to see Jabri on Tuesday night.
Now, you mentioned going forward, Georgia is hoping to solve problems at the forward position. And that is something that Xavier has really struggled with this year, too. So, talk a little bit more about that. What type of issues have they been dealing with at that forward spot? It sounds like these two teams might be kind of meant for each other here in the postseason.
Yeah, you sort of see some of these matchups in the NIT, and you kind of think, well, maybe this is part of the reason these teams are in the NIT after all. But they have seen progress, like I mentioned with Dylan James. He's a guy that's really emerged, a guy that really was not playing in conference play to start conference play this year, and then over the last month got bigger and bigger, got a bigger and bigger role, played more and more minutes, and that has definitely been a strong improvement to see him develop, because you kind of had a revolving door with RJ Melendez, with Jalen DeLoach, and it really hurt Georgia in the last game it played. So sort of having that lack of a big man that they could rely on, especially coming off the bench. Russell Chiwa's been their center. He's been a really good 5 for these guys coming over from South Florida. He gets in foul trouble. I think he had like 2 fouls in about 2.5 minutes against Florida. And he winds up in foul trouble. Then Jalen DeLoach, who's that power forward, he winds up in foul trouble. Then Frank Anselm-Ebay, another guy that they had come off the bench, he winds up in foul trouble. And it really was a way that Florida attacked them. They found that vulnerability and said, we're going to just keep working it down low. These guys, they can't be all over us. They're going to wind up fouling out of this game. And I do think that, honestly, Georgia played Florida really, really well. And that was the third time Georgia's played them this season. And I think if those guys didn't wind up in foul trouble, they would have had a shot and wound up being a 5-point loss. So, yeah, I think the biggest thing is it's just been such an unstable position. I think it has helped having a guy like Dylan James come up and play some big minutes, but he can't stay on the court the whole time. And I think they need some of these older guys who initially came to Georgia hoping they were going to have starting roles, hoping they could have bigger roles. Didn't wind up happening. They need these guys to step up, especially if they want to make a run in this tournament.
Russell Chiwa, the 7-footer that you're talking about, transferred over from South Florida. When I watch him, he kind of sometimes has the look of a guy who does some really great things. Like, he'll make an agile finish and a nice touch. And you're like, wow, he has some real tools to build on here. But then you look and you realize, like, he's kind of at the end of his career already. So I don't think he's like a guy building on potential. A little bit inconsistent at times with the moves he'll make in the post, but the way they use him, they will make you guard him a little bit, right? I mean, like, they'll throw the ball into him one-on-one in the post and let him go to work at times.
And I think you've seen that a little bit more. And I think they sort of realized maybe that should have been a point of attack earlier in the season. But you saw that a little bit more when Jabri Abdur-Rahim went out of the lineup. And Jabri, if you look at this team and some of their stronger games, they're at their most dangerous when they're hitting from 3-point range. And that's Jabri's bread and butter. I mean, that's the best thing he does is when he's really settled in as a 3-point shooter, he can really get the entire team going. But yeah, Chi was a guy that you look at some of the stats and, there are games where he just straight up dominates. I think about the SEC opener against Missouri at Missouri, has a double-double, and I think he was the difference in Georgia winning and losing that game. And then there's some games like that Tennessee game we talked about earlier where they were very much in the mix, and he was just a non-factor. And I think he's a guy, when you're that big at 7 foot, you want to see that guy, if he's not scoring double-digit points, at least keeping possessions alive, open up opportunities for his teammates. I will give him this. He's been a really nice passer in these last few games. I mean, he's been logging several assists, which you don't see a ton for that 5 spot. But yeah, when they get him going, he's a really dangerous guy. And he's somebody that, and I don't think this is uncommon for big men, if he misses a few shots early, you can kind of see him battling that. So pay attention to how he starts this game. If he's working really well down low, I think it'll give him confidence and will go a long way in what Georgia wants to do when it has the ball.
Yeah, I started with those front court players because I know that's the focus of Xavier fans. That's the big concern. They've struggled to defend the post so much this year. That's always kind of like, well, what does the opponent's front court look like first and foremost? So we started there, and maybe I buried the lead a little bit because the guy that I want to ask you about, who I've watched throughout this year, the transfer from Niagara, Noah Thomason, and he is a guy that when I watch him, I don't understand why he doesn't average more than 12 points per game. So explain this to me, because he's athletic, he's tough, he's strong, he's aggressive when he comes off ball screens and drives to the rim. He finishes well. He's not he's not a great 3-point shooter, but he hits a lot of step back, tough 3-point shots. Like, how would you assess his game and what's kind of limited him? Why is he not averaging like 15 to 20 points per game?
Well, I think the biggest thing, and he's a guy, when he committed to Georgia, watching his film from Niagara, I said, I think he could be Georgia's leading scorer. And I'm not sure where he is exactly right now. Him and Jabri had kind of
He's
traded
the
it back.
leader right now by a tenth of a point. Yeah.
Right. I knew it was close. But yeah, I mean, I think he's a guy that has sometimes just struggled with the inconsistency. I mean, I think the thing that I like the most about Noah's game, especially when it's hitting, he's got a nice jumper. And it feels like he can really, if he gets settled in, sort of like I was just saying with Chiwa, if he hits some of those early on, you can very noticeably see that confidence build in him. And there are some nights where just those early shots don't fall, and it feels like it's sort of a struggle. And when you look at this team on the whole, we talk about those close calls against teams like Tennessee and Alabama. It just felt like in some of those late minutes, everyone on the team was sort of looking around like, okay, who are we going to? We're going to count on this guy and he's going to score, 4 or 5 points in these last 4 minutes. We're going to win this game. I feel like Noah Thomason was the best positioned Georgia player to be able to do that, but he just hasn't been able to. And I think that that's a struggle. And it's not really just on Noah. I don't think this team has one guy that they can rely on and say, we can count on this guy to get a bucket. So Noah's really dangerous. I think he's done a really good job this year, and he's come through in some big moments. But I think that, you want to see that shooting guard maybe come through and be that guy, especially with what he has around him. He's had his moments, but I think sometimes, he's not been that answer that you would want and say, we can count on this guy in these final minutes of a game.
Now, I was just wondering if it was something like that, because it feels like every time I turn on a Georgia game, I see him. I'm like, hey, he seems like a tough guy to handle. He's coming off ball screens. He's so physical when he drives. He kind of he's almost like a little James Harden-esque, the way I'll kind of use a forearm shove to get a defender off of him and then finish over top of him from about 5 or 6 feet, or even getting all the way to the rim. 6'4", 210 pounds. I think back to like the Delaware game that Xavier lost in the non-conference. They had a guard by the name of Jalen Trent, who was like 6'4", 205 pounds. He wasn't as good of a shooter as Thomason, but he drove to the rim constantly, and Xavier really struggled to stop him. So from a Georgia perspective, fans are looking for a guy that might be able to go off against the Musketeers. That's the guy I really have my eye on, the guy I would be worried about from the Xavier perspective. And then I'll ask you about one more guard. Justin Hill seems like a guy that has had a few big games recently. I know his numbers aren't eye-popping, but scored 13 points and 17 points in the 2 SEC tournament games. Is he a guy that you feel like is catching fire at the right time, or are those just aberrations or game plan, scouting report matchup type things?
No, I think he's sort of figured it out, and sort of going back to the point I was just making of like, who is this guy we can count on? Give Justin Hill credit. He's never really hesitated to say, look, I'll go downhill and try to get you some points. It's worked sometimes, and sometimes it's blown up. and not going in Georgia's favor. But he's a really confident guy. I mean, earlier in non-conference play, Georgia got down 16 at Florida State, and they willed their way back. And Justin Hill hits the game winner in the final seconds. And even going to last season, they had a really close game in Athens on Valentine's Day against LSU, and Justin Hill hits the go ahead, or I think the game winner in the final second. So he's a really confident guy. I think sometimes his problem is sort of understanding what's in front of him. You know, he's usually the first guy off the bench, and he's the point guard behind Silas Demery. He's a guy that just sometimes just has careless turnovers, doesn't sometimes, misses that defender when he's trying to make a pass, and all of a sudden you're trying to get back in transition and get a stop. But he's a dangerous guy, and I can guarantee you if this game is close, I would feel pretty confident Mike White would have Justin Hill out there because, sometimes it's hit or miss, but he's a guy that's not going to be afraid to take a shot, and he's come through and helped Georgia in some big moments.
I'm not sure if I mentioned it before I asked that question, but he's a 6 foot, 185-pound guard. So keep an eye on him as well. Potential scorer to keep an eye on in that backcourt. All right, Jordan, great stuff. Is there anything I missed? Is there any storylines or any players that I should have asked you about that I'm not here?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the biggest thing, again, from the Georgia perspective is seeing if Jabri's able to go. Again, I don't expect him to, and how that sort of changes Georgia's game plan. I mean, I think that they've found some success, even in that SEC tournament, of really relying on its three-point shooting. And we'll see if they do that. I mean, it would probably be Noah Thomason and Blue Kane, who's another freshman, probably leading the way from three-point range. But no, I'm just excited to see this game get underway. This is the first time Georgia's played in the postseason at all since 2017. So I do think that this means something for the fans and for the program, and they're going to see if they can make something out of it.
Awesome. Well, that's Jordan Hill from our Georgia 24/7 site, Dawgs247. Love the background there, by the way. It looks excellent on camera. Thank you for your help today. I really appreciate you checking in.
All right. Thanks.